A luxury SUV blocks a quiet rural driveway. A farmer's green tractor rumbles out of a weathered barn. Neighbors film with their phones. Mud splashes, tension builds, and the camera zooms on a single note pinned under a windshield wiper, a threat from the HOA president. In the next moments, steel meets arrogance, and an entire war begins. If you love real-life property and HOA drama stories like this one, don't forget to hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the next shocking twist. Your support helps us bring you true-to-life tales of justice, revenge, and redemption. The morning began with a chill that smelled of wet soil and fresh-cut grass. Golden beams of early light slid across a farm that had been in one family for 4 generations. Cattle shifted lazily behind the fence line, steam rising from their nostrils in the cool air. The barn loomed at the edge of the gravel drive, its wood darkened by decades of storms and sun, a cathedral of hay and history. This land had been carved from wilderness with calloused hands and iron will, and the current caretaker knew every inch of it like the lines of his own palm. Out on the main road, traffic hissed by now and then, but at the farmhouse itself there was a steady, predictable rhythm. Chores, coffee, tools, work. It was a rhythm as old as the soil. That rhythm shattered when an alien presence rolled onto the gravel and stopped dead across the only exit. A white luxury SUV, spotless, oversized, gleaming like a dentist's smile, sat across the driveway like a barricade. Its tires crushed the soft edges of the verge, leaving ugly tracks. Sunlight glinted off chrome and tinted windows. This wasn't a neighbor's casual visit or a delivery gone wrong. It was a deliberate act. On the windshield, pinned under a polished wiper blade, was a folded note written on heavy, expensive paper. The script was sharp, aggressive, and unmistakable. It came from the Homeowners Association president, the self-styled queen of Briarwood Estates, whose pastel blouses and clipped tone had already invaded too many lives. The message was short, commanding, dripping with entitlement, a demand to stay put until she returned to discuss a new community access point. For the farmer, that access point was no minor path. It was the best pasture on his property, the place where his cattle grazed and where his great-grandfather once plowed with a mule. For her, it was a shortcut for a planned subdivision, a way to turn someone else's legacy into her profit. Letters had come before, veiled threats wrapped in bureaucratic language, but they had been ignored. Now the threat was parked in steel across his only exit. The land was quiet, but inside the house tension rose like a barometer before a storm. A load of feed needed picking up in town. Livestock wouldn't wait for meetings. The note's final words, "Don't go anywhere," settled like a stone in the gut. The arrogance was breathtaking, the audacity almost surreal. In the barn sat an old John Deere tractor, its green paint dulled by years of honest labor, its engine still strong, a 12-ton promise of power. The machine had moved hay bales the size of small cars, uprooted oaks whose roots ran deep, and cleared ditches after floods. It was more than a tool. It was a statement. And on that cool morning, the statement was about to be made. Neighbors, curious and cautious, drifted to porches and fence lines. They sipped coffee from chipped mugs, phones already in hand. They'd seen skirmishes with the HOA before, but nothing like this. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that comes before the first clap of thunder. In the farmhouse kitchen, a camera hidden in a birdhouse blinked red, silently streaming everything to the cloud. The stage was set. The lines between private property and community control had been drawn, and now a single act of defiance would blur them forever. The tractor's engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a deep, throaty growl that shook dust from the rafters. It rolled out of the barn like a slow, unstoppable beast, its massive tires leaving deep impressions in the damp ground. From a distance, the white SUV looked like a toy at the feet of a giant. Steel forks lowered with hydraulic precision, slipping under the SUV's frame just behind the front wheels. Years of farm work had taught the operator balance, patience, and quiet control. This wasn't a wild charge, it was a careful lift. The vehicle rose smoothly, its front end tilting upward, headlights staring skyward like a dog begging for a treat. Neighbors held their breath. Phones tilted up to capture the moment. Slowly, deliberately, the tractor inched forward, carrying its prize toward the drainage ditch that bordered the road. Grass bent under the weight, mud glistened darkly at the bottom. A gentle nudge on the lever and the SUV settled into the grass with a soft hiss of tires, then a muddy thump as its frame rested on the bank. Another tap and gravity took over. The SUV rolled nose first into the ditch, coming to rest at a ridiculous angle, its tail sticking up like a white flag that would never wave. Silence followed, then a ripple of laughter, then cheers from a few bold onlookers. A phone camera caught every second, framing not just a moment of rural justice but the opening salvo of a much larger battle. Because what had just happened wasn't an end, it was a beginning. The HOA president might be embarrassed now, but humiliation breeds retaliation, and retaliation breeds war. Back at the house, the farmer's wife stood on the porch, phone in hand, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The video feed from the birdhouse cam was crystal clear. She saved the file twice, once locally, once to the cloud. Evidence. Proof. Insurance. The note on the windshield had said, "Don't go anywhere." Now the SUV wasn't going anywhere either. A problem seemed solved, but the air over the farm felt charged, like static before lightning. In the distance, the first siren wailed faintly. Someone had called the sheriff. Online, the video began to circulate before the HOA president's tow truck even arrived. A stranger's dashcam captured it from another angle and posted it with a title destined to go viral. Comments poured in, cheering the farmer's ingenuity, calling the tractor a justice delivery system. But experience taught him one truth: bullies don't retreat when embarrassed. They get quiet, they get methodical, and then they strike back harder. The driveway was clear, but a line had been crossed, and the war for the pasture had just begun. 2 days after the ditch incident, the first official retaliation arrived. It didn't come with flashing lights or a knock on the door. It came in the mail, a thick, cream-colored envelope that smelled faintly of expensive perfume and bureaucratic menace. The return address bore the HOA's seal. Inside was a letter that looked as though it belonged in a law firm rather than a neighborhood association. The words were clinical, yet laced with quiet rage. The association had levied a list of fines: $500 for unauthorized operation of agricultural machinery on a residential access road, $1,000 for unapproved modification of community landscape, due to the SUV's tire marks, and $2,000 for creating a public nuisance and safety hazard, citing the viral video as evidence of aggressive and unpredictable behavior. It was absurd, like receiving a ticket from the wolf for breaking his teeth on your sheep, but it was also a warning shot. The HOA president wasn't just embarrassed, she was building a paper trail, laying the groundwork for something bigger. In the farmhouse kitchen, documents began to pile up on the table. Every envelope was opened, scanned, and filed. Every threat was dated, every fine recorded. The farmer's wife, patient and meticulous, became a general behind the lines, assembling a dossier as if preparing for trial. Meanwhile, life on the farm went on. Cattle still needed feed. Fields still needed tending. But beneath the surface, tension hummed. Each trip out to mend a fence or check a gate felt like walking into an ambush. The once quiet property had turned into contested ground. The first act of sabotage came quietly. One moonless night, the low hum of the big diesel tank's transfer pump stopped. At 3 a.m, boots hit cold, dew-drenched grass. A padlock had been snapped off with bolt cutters, the hose from the main storage tank lying like a dead snake on the ground. 500 gallons of diesel, the lifeblood of the farm, had been siphoned away. A single boot print remained in the mud. Cheap work boots, distinctive star pattern on the heel, wrong size. Evidence. The next morning, the gate to the back pasture wasn't opened. It was cut. Heavy gauge wire severed cleanly in 3 places. Cattle had scattered into the pre-dawn dark, some wandering dangerously close to the main road. Hours were spent chasing them down, flashlights sweeping fields and ditches. Neighbors called in to help. The herd was recovered, but the message was clear. This was no longer about fines or bylaws. It was a calculated campaign to create chaos and paint the farmer as negligent, the perfect villain for the HOA's narrative. First, a dangerous tractor. Now, loose cattle. Each incident fed the story that the land was a hazard, that control needed to be taken from its owner for the good of the community. By midday, mud and exhaustion weighed heavy. The patched fence stood as a fragile line between order and ruin. The stolen fuel meant days of lost work and thousands of dollars gone. More than that, it meant vulnerability. The farm's heartbeat, the tractor, had been targeted. In the farmhouse, photos of the broken lock, the cut fence, and the boot print were laid out like evidence in a courtroom. Costs were estimated. Timelines drawn. A growing file folder labeled Karen swelled with each page. The kitchen table had become a war room. The farmer's patience, deep as his fields, had been drained. Reaction had run its course. Now came planning. He traced the property line on a satellite printout. 160 acres. Too much to patrol, too much to guard. The attacks were predictable. Fuel tanks, main gate. Bullies rarely innovate. They returned to what worked. This time, what worked for them would be turned into a trap. The next morning's errands were unusual for a farmer. Instead of the feed store, the truck rolled into a specialty electronics shop and a hunting supply store. High-definition motion-activated game cameras with night vision. Tiny GPS trackers small enough to hide on a tractor. A bottle of invisible ultraviolet dye meant to detect leaks. Harmless, but under black light it glowed brilliant blue. That afternoon, birdhouses were built and modified in the workshop. Rustic on the outside, they hid small wireless cameras streaming directly to an app. One was mounted overlooking the main driveway and front gate. Another on the barn, aimed at the fuel tank. A third on an oak tree at the edge of the back pasture, aimed at the section of fence that had been cut. Game cameras were hidden deeper in bushes to cover other approaches. GPS trackers were tucked into the engine compartment of the main tractor and under the frame of the flatbed trailer. If equipment was stolen, it would be traceable. The final piece was bait. A smaller 55-gallon drum filled with fresh diesel and mixed with the ultraviolet dye. A brand new cheap padlock was left slightly loose on the valve. An invitation. There was a moment of doubt, a question about how far was too far. Was this revenge or defense? But images of cattle wandering a dark highway silenced it. This was about protecting the farm. With the traps set, there was nothing to do but wait. Nights became vigils in the living room, the TV on low, eyes fixed on live feeds from hidden cameras. Every shadow a potential intruder, every rustle of leaves a false alarm. The first night, nothing. The second, a deer. The third, rain. On the fourth night, just after midnight, a soft chime on the tablet broke the quiet. Motion detected at the barn camera. Grainy night vision image, black and white but unmistakable. A lone figure in dark clothes and a hoodie moved toward the smaller fuel drum, bolt cutters in hand, siphon hose coiled. The rat had found the cheese. Boots slid on wet grass as the farmer slipped out the back door, mag light in one hand, a small ultraviolet flashlight in the other. The drizzle had stopped, but the air was heavy. He moved silently, circling behind the barn. 10 feet away, the intruder siphoned diesel into plastic cans in the back of a beat-up dark-colored pickup truck. Fuel gurgled. A splash on hands and jacket cuff. He didn't notice. This wasn't a monster. He looked like a man in his 40s, thin, wiry, nervous, cheap work boots with a star pattern on the heel. The same signature from the boot print by the empty tank. The trap had sprung. Night clung to the farm like a wet blanket. Clouds smothered the stars. The only light came from the dim security lamp above the barn and the soft green glow of the hidden camera icon on the tablet back in the kitchen. Out here, the air smelled of damp earth and diesel. The intruder crouched at the small fuel drum exactly as planned. His bolt cutters lay on the ground, a broken padlock next to them like a fallen tooth. The siphon hose gurgled steadily, filling plastic gas cans in the bed of a beat-up pickup truck. Dark sleeves glistened with spilled fuel. The splash on his cuffs looked like nothing in ordinary light but would blaze like fire under ultraviolet. Boot soles pressed quietly into grass as the farmer circled around the back of the barn. Years of walking this land in all seasons had taught him every dip and rut. He moved without a flashlight, without a sound, becoming part of the night. 10 feet away, he stopped, watching. The man was so focused on his task he never looked up. This was the moment where frustration and patience met. For weeks fines had arrived, cattle had been scattered, fuel drained. Now all that chaos condensed into a single figure hunched over a siphon hose. The farmer felt no thrill, only a cold clarity. He stepped forward and snapped on the beam of his heavy maglite. A pillar of white light tore the darkness apart, landing squarely on the man's hands. He flinched, threw up an arm to shield his face, then froze, blinded and cornered. The night swallowed his excuses before they formed. Without a word, the farmer switched flashlights. Darkness for a heartbeat. Then the ultraviolet beam flicked on. At once, the intruder's hands and cuffs erupted in a ghostly electric blue glow. Drops of fuel on the ground glimmered like tiny stars. The tip of the siphon hose glowed as if radioactive. The man stared at his own hands, mouth opening in disbelief. He had been marked without knowing it, caught literally blue-handed. Panic overtook him. He spun to run, but his boots skidded on slick mud and spilled diesel. He went down hard, scrambled up, slipped again. Years of farm work had made the older man solid and quick in his own way. He stepped in, planted his feet, and caught the intruder by the front of his jacket. No punch, no shove, just a firm turn and a pin against the barn siding. The man's fight dissolved. He sagged, breathing hard, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Words tumbled out of him, fast, fragmented, a confession in everything but form. "It wasn't my idea, she paid me." The master's name hovered unsaid but obvious. Every flick of his eyes toward the road was a signal to someone who wasn't coming. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and old wood replaced the smell of wet diesel. The farmer marched him to a wooden crate and sat him down. He still didn't raise his eyes, only stared at his glowing hands as if they belonged to someone else. Moments later the kitchen door opened and the farmer's wife stepped in. She didn't address the intruder. She set a small digital voice recorder on the workbench and pressed record. A tiny red light blinked. Evidence. Calmly, methodically, she drew out the truth. The man was a local handyman, broke and desperate, hired by the HOA president first for small repairs, then for sabotage. He described how she'd handed him bolt cutters and cash. How she'd instructed him to drain the diesel, cut the fence, and make the farmer look negligent. How the whole campaign was designed to force the sale of an easement for a planned luxury development. The HOA fines, the broken gate, the stolen fuel, all part of a manufactured narrative. Every detail spilled out under the soft glow of the recorder's red eye. The shell company, the consulting fee, the promise that if they made life hard enough the farmer would fold. The wife wrote it all down, crisp notes on a yellow legal pad. When the confession ended, she slid a paper across the workbench, a typed statement mirroring his words. "Sign and you're a witness," she said without saying. "Refuse and you're the only criminal in the room." The choice was obvious. With trembling fingers still glowing faintly blue, he signed. The beat-up pickup truck was rolled into the equipment bay and chained inside. The intruder left on foot, warned never to return. His keys, his bolt cutters, and his confession stayed behind. Evidence. Back in the kitchen, adrenaline drained away, leaving a hard, cold resolve. The couple had proof now, video, confession, statement, but they knew it still wasn't enough. Against a polished HOA president, a single handyman's word would be shredded in court. They needed more. They needed the money trail, the paper trail, the thread that led from Karen Tyson straight to the shell company she was using to enrich herself. On the kitchen table, the war map of their property gave way to a different kind of battlefield. County records, corporate filings, genealogies. The wife's fingers flew across a keyboard, weaving through public databases and meeting minutes. Hours ticked by under the glow of a desk lamp. Coffee cooled and was replaced. Outside, frost formed on the barn roof. Just before dawn, the first crack appeared. The HOA's website listed a special board meeting 3 weeks earlier authorizing legal action on the easement. Neighbor Ed had said there was no such meeting. The minutes were fake. The second crack came in the shell company record. Oak Ridge Estates was registered in another state, but its legal agent's name matched the HOA president's maiden name, Karen Miller. She had created a company to pay herself, using the HOA as a weapon to take land for a development she secretly owned. They had her confession, video, fake minutes, money trail. The trap had been sprung and the queen rat had left her name on the cheese. But just as relief began to settle in, reality intruded. She would know her handyman had been caught. She would act before the evidence reached the authorities. The war was not over. It was about to enter its most dangerous phase. Daylight on the farm had a way of softening everything: fences, grudges, even the memory of sabotage. But at night, under a Midwestern sky swollen with storm clouds, all softness vanished. The air grew heavy and electric. The smell of ozone crept over the pastures. Trees whispered warnings before the wind began to howl. By dusk, thunder was already rolling far off, a low drumbeat marching closer. Lightning flickered beyond the horizon, illuminating the fields in brief, ghostly flashes. The couple in the farmhouse moved through quiet rituals: oil lamps laid out, phones charged with battery packs, the live feeds from hidden cameras glowing on a tablet like windows into another world. They had evidence. They had confession. They believed they had time to hand it all to the sheriff. They didn't. Sometime after midnight the storm arrived with biblical fury. Rain came down in sheets so thick it blurred the shape of the barn. Wind rattled windows and bent the tree line. Power flickered once, twice, then vanished, plunging the house into flickering lamplight and long, restless shadows. A chime broke through the roar of the storm. Not thunder, not wind, but the soft electronic notification from the oak tree camera at the far end of the property. Both of them leaned in close to the tablet. Grainy night vision struggled against the rain, but the image was unmistakable. The beat-up dark pickup truck, the same one the handyman had used, idled at the main gate. This time there were 2 men. They weren't creeping. One had a heavy chain, looping it through the gate. The other stayed in the truck. They weren't vandals anymore. They were muscle, here to take Jerry's impounded truck from the equipment bay, smash the cameras, and destroy evidence before it could reach law enforcement. The wife dialed 911, but the phone line was dead, the tower knocked out by the storm. They were on their own. In the living room a plan formed wordlessly. The panic horn was set on the counter. The pantry door was unlocked. Then the farmer grabbed his keys and the heaviest flashlight and stepped into the storm. Rain hit like a waterfall, instantly soaking him to the bone. The gravel driveway was a river of mud. Instead of heading for his pickup, he went for something bigger: the old green tractor, idling under the lean-to shed, its engine a beastly growl against the thunder. It roared to life, headlights cutting 2 fierce beams through the downpour. 12 tons of green steel and hydraulic muscle rolled forward, snapping through a side section of fence without slowing. Wires screamed and curled back as the tractor plowed through, angling toward the main drive where the pickup was now tugging at the chained gate. Lightning split the sky. For a heartbeat he saw their faces, wide, mean, already wavering between aggression and fear. The chain snapped off the hinge and whipped across the hood of their truck. They floored the engine. Mud sprayed. He swung left, rear tires sliding, blocking their path. The storm howled so loud it drowned out thought, but his motions were slow and deliberate. He didn't have to hit them. He just had to herd them. The truck lurched forward, trying to dart past the tractor, but the ground between the barn and equipment shed had turned to soup. Tires spun uselessly. The green machine kept coming, bucket lowered like a battering ram but never striking, just pressing, like an iron shepherd with two frightened wolves. Beyond the shed, the land sloped toward the big irrigation pond. He knew every inch of that slope. They didn't. The driver gunned the engine, trying to swing the rear end around. For a moment it looked like they might regain control. Then the back wheels slid off the edge of the graded path. The truck hung there for a heartbeat, balanced between escape and disaster, then slid nose first down the embankment into the pond. A great splash rose above the headlights. Water closed over the hood. The truck's taillights stuck up like two red eyes drowning in murk. He stopped the tractor at the edge, headlights illuminating the scene. Two men scrambled out the passenger window into waist-deep water, soaked, sputtering, terrified. A pair of small dark rectangles floated free from the cab, burner phones, bobbing on the surface. Without hesitation he waded into the icy water and snatched them before they could sink. More evidence. On the bank, the storm began to ease, thunder moving off into the distance. The fight had gone out of the intruders. They slogged to shore, dripping and defeated. High above them, the tractor idled, a green sentinel in the night. When the sheriff finally arrived an hour later, phone lines restored, the scene was almost serene. Two soaked men sitting in handcuffs on the ground, a pickup truck sticking out of the pond at a ridiculous angle, and a farmer standing in mud holding two sealed plastic bags with burner phones inside. He handed over Jerry's signed confession, the video files, the fake HOA minutes, and the shell company filings, all neatly organized. The sheriff read through the binder under his cruiser's lights, expression growing grimmer with each page. "These two aren't talking," he said, "but I have a feeling these phones will." For the first time in months the couple felt the weight shift. They had been reacting, absorbing blows, documenting. Now the evidence was out of their hands and in official custody. But they also knew the battle wasn't finished. There was still one card left to play. The HOA had a regularly scheduled meeting that Friday night, usually a dull affair about budgets and lawn ornaments. But this time, the farmer and his wife would be there. They would end it not in court months from now, but in front of the very people the HOA president had bullied for years. The storm had passed. The mud was drying. The stage for the final act was set. Friday evening the community clubhouse, normally half empty, pulsed with a low hum like a beehive about to swarm. Cars lined the street in both directions. People who usually sent polite proxy votes were standing shoulder to shoulder at the back wall, clutching folded agendas. Some were angry, some curious, some just sensing the tension in the air and wanting to see it break. At the front of the room, beneath a banner reading Briarwood Estates Homeowners Association, the president stood at the podium. She looked polished as ever. Pastel blazer, pearls, a stack of folders arrayed like a queen's chess pieces. But the edges of her smile were tight. She was not used to a crowd this large or this restless. She began the meeting in the usual sing-song of budgets, contracts, landscaping bids. It sounded rehearsed, a performance given to an audience that wasn't listening. The air was thick with anticipation. Every seat was taken, people stood in the aisles. Whispers ran along the rows like currents under ice. In the third row, the farmer rose. His boots left faint smudges of dried mud on the polished tile. He had never spoken at one of these meetings before. Heads turned, conversations died. The HOA president's smile tightened further. The farmer didn't take the microphone immediately. He set a phone on the podium and tapped a button. A soft chime echoed from the speakers. "This meeting is now being live-streamed," his wife said clearly for the record. The camera faced the crowd. Comments began to scroll on the screen. A ripple went through the room. Neighbors craned to see. The president leaned toward a side microphone, thinking it muted, and hissed for someone to delete the feed. The chat exploded. People watching from home typed in real time, "We heard that. Play the video." Show the blue hands. What followed wasn't a speech. It was an unfolding. Piece by piece, the farmer and his wife laid out what had happened over the past month. The blocked driveway. The SUV gently lifted into the ditch. The fines. The broken fence. The stolen fuel. And then the first video clip appeared on the projector they had brought. The handyman crouched by the fuel drum, his hands glowing electric blue under ultraviolet light. The room went silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. The wife read aloud the signed confession, each word a nail in a coffin. The farmer explained how the HOA president had falsified meeting minutes to give herself authority to sue. Then the final slide appeared, a corporate filing for Oak Ridge Estates next to an old wedding announcement bearing the president's maiden name. The picture was unmistakable. The developer who stood to make millions from the access road was the same person now presiding over the HOA. She had been using the association as a weapon to take land and enrich herself. The crowd erupted. Voices rose in waves: disbelief, anger, vindication. One by one, people stood up. The woman fined for planting the wrong color flowers described months of harassment. A man spoke about the president threatening a lien over a child's swing set. Another told of being fined for parking a trailer in his own driveway. Years of small grievances spilled out like floodwater behind a breached dam. Within a week the local news had picked it up. Tractor Justice in Briarwood read one headline. A national outlet called it, "The HOA that went too far." Clips of the blue-handed handyman and the president's SUV sliding into the ditch played on loop with bold captions. But legal victory is never quick. Court calendars moved slowly. Developers hired new lawyers. A motion appeared to dismiss the charges as a personal vendetta. The farmer and his wife found themselves making repeated trips into town for depositions, interviews, and meetings with the district attorney. Yet the tide had shifted. They were no longer alone. Other HOA members filed their own complaints, joining a civil suit to recover fines and damages. The state attorney general opened an inquiry into HOA abuse and undisclosed conflicts of interest. Meanwhile, Briarwood Estates faced a vacuum. With the president jailed and several board members resigning, the association was effectively leaderless. Trash pickup faltered. The lawn service contract lapsed. For a brief moment, chaos threatened to replace tyranny. The couple proposed a different path. Instead of simply replacing one board with another, they suggested rewriting the bylaws, stripping the HOA of powers it had abused, returning control of private property to the owners. At the first emergency meeting, people who had never spoken before volunteered for committees. Retired teachers, mechanics, and young parents began drafting rules that actually served residents instead of punishing them. The barnyard war room shifted focus. Maps and evidence gave way to meeting agendas and proposed amendments. Where there had been hidden cameras, there were now open invitations to neighbors. Where there had been fear, there was coffee and laughter. Through it all, the farm work continued. Fences were repaired for the last time. The diesel tanks were moved closer to the house and fitted with permanent locking cages. The big green tractor, once an instrument of quiet defiance, returned to hauling hay and plowing fields. It stood in the barn at night like a retired soldier, paint dulled but still ready. One evening, after a long day of clearing debris from a fallen oak, the couple sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the pasture. The air was cool and smelled of honeysuckle. Crickets started their evening chorus. For the first time in months, the horizon didn't feel like a threat. A text buzzed on the farmer's phone. It was from the county prosecutor. He had secured an indictment on every charge and added a new one: wire fraud. The burner phones had contained messages tying the HOA president directly to her shell company. The case was airtight. Still, he felt no triumph, only relief. The land was safe for now, but he knew developers would return in another form someday. What mattered was that the community had learned to stand together. The fear had been broken. As twilight deepened, a few neighbors walked up the drive, children in tow, carrying a folding table and coolers. Someone had suggested a potluck on the farm to celebrate the end of the old board. Word had spread. Soon cars were lining the road again, but this time there was no SUV blocking the driveway, no notes under wipers. Only laughter, music from a small speaker, and the smell of barbecue drifting across the field. It wasn't the end of the story. There would be hearings, restitution, new elections, but it was the end of a chapter. The farm, scarred but unbroken, had become the heart of a neighborhood learning how to govern itself without fear. Inside the barn, the green tractor sat silent, its headlights dark, but the mud still clinging to its tires told a different story, of a moment when patience and power met, and a line was drawn in steel. The courthouse in the county seat was an old sandstone building with high arched windows and polished wooden benches worn smooth by decades of small-town dramas. On the morning of the hearing, its corridors buzzed with reporters and curious residents. The farmer and his wife walked up the broad steps quietly, side by side, the weight of months of conflict compressed into a single folder under his arm. Inside it were the same documents that had once sat on their kitchen table: videos, confessions, shell company records. At the defense table sat the former HOA president. Gone were the pastel blouses and pearls. She wore a plain suit now, hair pinned tightly back, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. Beside her, an expensive attorney shuffled papers, whispering urgently. Behind them, two of the hired men, the handyman and his accomplice from the pond, waited in a holding area, already sentenced on lesser charges. The district attorney laid out the case with clinical precision. Each exhibit built on the last. The viral video of the tractor gently lifting the SUV into the ditch, the ultraviolet footage of the handyman siphoning diesel, the false HOA meeting minutes, the wire transfers from the shell company to the consultants. Piece by piece the narrative of intimidation and fraud came into focus. Reporters scribbled notes. The judge, an old man with silver hair and a reputation for fairness, leaned forward more and more as the evidence mounted. There was no bluster now, no HOA rules to hide behind, only statutes and facts. When it was the defense's turn, their arguments sounded small, almost ridiculous. That the farmer had provoked her, that the fines were legitimate, that she had no knowledge of the sabotage. But the burner phones told a different story. Text messages appeared on the big screen. Drain tanks tonight. Cut fence before sunrise. We need him to look negligent. Each one signed off with her initials. A hush filled the courtroom. Even her own attorney lowered his eyes. In a voice stripped of ceremony, the judge read the verdict. Guilty on conspiracy to commit grand theft. Guilty on felony vandalism. Guilty on racketeering and wire fraud. Sentencing would follow in 30 days, but the bailiff led her away in handcuffs immediately, her gaze fixed on the floor as cameras clicked. Outside the courthouse the crowd erupted, not with cheers but with a strange collective exhale, a release of tension that had built for years. Neighbors who had once whispered about fines and liens now stood openly, talking to reporters, holding up copies of their own dismissed citations. Over the next few weeks, restitution began. The HOA's insurance policy, triggered by criminal acts of a board member, paid out claims to residents who had been fined illegally. The shell company's assets were frozen, then liquidated. With the proceeds, the county purchased a conservation easement for the disputed pasture, ensuring it could never be developed without the owner's consent. The farmer signed the easement papers on a windy afternoon at the county clerk's office. It was a small stack of documents, but it felt like anchoring his family's history into the ground. No future board could take it, no shortcut could be forced through. Meanwhile, Briarwood Estates held a special election under new bylaws drafted by volunteers. Term limits, transparent finances, and an independent ethics committee replaced secret fines and intimidation. Meetings moved to the community park rather than the clubhouse, and live streaming became standard practice. The couple rarely spoke at these meetings. They sat on folding chairs at the edge, listening as younger neighbors took on the work of rebuilding. The HOA's power, once a weapon, had become a tool for basic maintenance again. Streetlights, playground mulch, nothing more. Yet the past lingered. The videos continued to circulate online, racking up millions of views. Comments called the farmer a hero, the tractor the green gavel of justice. Offers came in for interviews, book deals, even a reality show. They declined them all. This wasn't entertainment to them. It was their life, their land, their peace. On the day of sentencing, the courthouse was quieter. There were no speeches. The judge read out the term: 7 years in state prison, restitution, permanent ban from serving on any HOA board. The hired men received probation and mandatory community service. As the former president was led away, she looked once at the farmer. He didn't gloat or smile. He only nodded once, a gesture of finality. The war was over. That evening the couple drove back down the familiar road to the farm. The fields rolled out on either side, green and gold under the setting sun. The barn stood dark and solid, the tractor inside resting like a sleeping giant. For the first time in a year, the driveway was empty and silent. Neighbors waved as they passed. Children on bicycles rode alongside for a few yards before veering off into the subdivision. At the mailbox stood a small group of older residents holding a handmade sign, "Thank you." He raised a hand in return but said nothing. The gravel under his tires made its old comforting crunch. The farm's gate swung open easily. It wasn't triumph he felt, but quiet belonging. The land was his again, not just on paper but in a year past, like the slow turning of the seasons. Spring's pale green had deepened to summer's dense shade, then faded into autumn's gold before snow came and melted again. Through it all, the farm settled back into its own rhythm: sunrise over the fields, the lowing of cattle, the steady clatter of chores that no storm or board meeting could ever erase. The new Briarwood HOA became almost invisible. With a volunteer board and limited powers, its meetings were brief, its finances transparent. People came and went freely, no fines, no threat. Streetlights were repaired. Playgrounds were cleaned. The association's name no longer conjured fear but little more than routine maintenance. On the farm itself, the scars of the conflict slowly disappeared. The cut fences were replaced with new, stronger wire. Grass regrew over the muddy ruts where trucks had once idled at night. The fuel tanks sat behind a locked, well-lit enclosure. The birdhouse cameras remained but had become mostly ornamental. Foxes and deer were now their only visitors. The green tractor returned to its quiet duties: hay, tilling, moving feed. Mud still clung to the inside of its wheel wells from that stormy night, a faint reminder of the moment it stopped being a tool and became a line in the sand. On a mild spring evening, neighbors gathered at the farm for a potluck. Long tables were set up between the barn and the oak tree. Children chased each other across the pasture. Older residents swapped stories about the bad old days of fines and threat. Nobody whispered anymore. Laughter rolled across the field like warm wind. The farmer sat on the porch steps, a paper plate balanced on his knee. His wife leaned against the railing, chatting with a neighbor about a new community garden project. They were no longer the embattled center of a viral story. They were just part of the neighborhood again. Beyond the pasture, the conservation easement line was marked by small wooden posts. Wildflowers had begun to grow there: bluebells, Indian paintbrush, milkweed, a living boundary, rooted deeper than any survey stake. Every time he walked past them, he felt a small surge of gratitude. The land was protected now not just by paper, but by people who had learned to stand together. Online, the story had taken on a life of its own. Tractor Justice compilations circulated on social media, a meme of rural calm confronting suburban arrogance. But for the people who had lived it, the story was no meme. It was a hard-won lesson in patience, preparation, and the quiet power of a community when it finally refuses to be afraid. As dusk deepened, the farmer stood and walked to the edge of the field. Fireflies blinked above the grass. He rested a hand on one of the wooden posts and looked back at the farmhouse glowing warmly against the dark. Music from a neighbor's speaker drifted across the yard. He didn't think of the HOA president anymore. He didn't think of the courtrooms, the storm, or the ditch. He thought about planting winter rye, fixing the north fence, and maybe building a new hay shed. Life had returned to its scale. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely at home on his own land. And that was the real victory. Not headlines or hashtags, but the quiet return of normal life after a fight worth having. The camera pulls back slowly, rising above the barn and the pasture, showing the green tractor parked neatly under the lean-to, the neighbors laughing around picnic tables, and the long, straight driveway clear and open under the evening sky.